You see, Brother Elton, I'd like to take you to task on that particular notion of the African contribution to the development of Guyana, wherein it is true that our ancestors' endeavors have resulted in them making a contribution to the commonwealth of the nation. Because of the current circumstances where we face the hostility, just like our ancestors faced, had to deal with a very hostile socio-political and economic environment, I believe that it is essential for us to mirror in the modern context, at least in part, what is it our ancestors did and the environment in which they operated. In doing my reading for this discussion, I recognized that our ancestors were not necessarily thinking about a nation, they were thinking about their own survival. When they were put out of the plantations, quote unquote, on the 1st of August, 1838, they were faced with the need to survive in a very hostile environment in which they existed for approximately 200 years, where they worked and where approximately at least 445 or to close to 500,000 of them died to develop that plantation industry, and then that sugar plantation industry, coffee, cocoa, and the cotton and the whole lot. And then on August 1st, when their services had become expendable by virtue of the Abolition Act, the most cruel and insensitive act was executed against them. They were told, we don't need you, and so you better find a place to live. Mighty Sparrow said, we were put out of the place. What is interesting also too is that having worked for 200 years and no pay, on August 1st, the British government, instead of giving us a little bit of money to go and make we heights, as we just call it here in Guyana, what the Europeans did is that they rewarded themselves to the tune of £45 million for the loss of the services which they were entitled to under the plantation slavery system. $20 million in cash, which incidentally the British government only finished paying off, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, and $27 million in kind by way of services. So our ancestors had to work for another 4 years for no pay so that they can get that 27 million pounds. And so, Brother Elton, you know, this is what I want to let my younger brothers and sisters understand, that our ancestors were forced to, under very hostile circumstances, they were forced to survive, and that they did it successfully. When they bought New Orange, Nassau, when they bought Northbrook, when they bought Agricola, when they bought Agricola, also known as Jonestown, when they bought Denhamstel, when they bought those plantations along the Quarantine, which they were dispossessed of, and it was handed to the indentured servants, the Indian indentured servants who came here. When they did that, they were not thinking of contributing to the development of the nation. They were thinking about the contribution to their own survival and their children's and their children's children and their children's children in perpetuity, their survival. And that is the context within which I would like to discuss my ancestors' legacy in this nation, which is called Guyana.
Okay, so you say that our ancestors, your ancestors, my ancestors' contribution is significant. One of the significant aspects of it is the purchasing of those plantations, abandoned plantations, in some cases, plantations which were generally unprofitable in the first instance, those which were unprofitable. And we know that once they started dividing these plantations, the prices of the land, the plantations went up. In fact, they were buying the plantations as group cooperatives, and then laws were instituted to say that you cannot buy this, you have to buy it to so as to force them to be desegregated and each man try to buy a plantation, which was an impossibility. So how do you see, how was our people able to negotiate that as continue buying plantations?
But that's not a very interesting question. Before I answer that question, or in answering that question, I'd like to preface the answer with a little bit of advice. I would like to advise all Africans in Guyana, and there is a growing number of Africans from the continent who have come here post-slavery, but who would have been subjected, or who may have been subjected on the mother continent to colonialization, is to look yourself in the mirror. Take a look at yourself in the mirror and don't believe what you perceive yourself to be seeing. In other words, when you look in the mirror, you may tend to think that you are seeing something, but question that image that you're seeing. Because we have been victims of an indoctrination, and the stereotyping of ourselves, which make ourselves look less than we really are, less beautiful than we really are, less successful than we really are. And the question that Brother Elton just asked is an indication really of how successful we have been. After 1828, when our ancestors were forced off of the plantations, or when they were forced to go and find some place to live, they began to buy plantations. And I emphasize and I exclaim plantations, because my ancestors and the Africans who walked off of those plantations did not buy villages. They bought plantations and estates where the intention was to provide themselves primarily with a place to sustain their existence, which of course necessitated them having a place to rest their heads and to live and to go to school and to worship their Lord. Well, like I said before, to plant rice, to fish, etc., to farm, so that they could live. But what they purchased was plantations. Brother Elton asked the question, he mentioned in his preamble, in his question, that prices shot up. I'll give you an example of what he was talking about. Vigilance, for instance, in 1831 was sold for $15,000. Vigilance was sold for $15,000 in 1831. After our ancestors started buying up these properties, 10 years later, in 1841, from 1831 to 1841, the asking rate for plantation vigilance was $90,000. $90,000. Our ancestors, in their greatness, raised a significant part of that $90,000 to buy vigilance. But the stipendiary magistrate said to them, listen, this is rank exploitation. Don't buy it. And so they did not buy it. But what is essential is to give you an example of how prices appreciated. Now, how did they maintain the purchasing of these lands in this hostile economic environment? Don't forget the environment in which they are operating. It's a set of people who were worked for no pay for their labor by those who were exploiting the labor for 200 years, not 200 days, not for 20 hours, for 200 years and probably more. And then when they try to provide themselves with the necessities for a continued life, they are exploited in this particular way, where in 10 years, the price of property moves from $15,000 to $90,000. How did they survive that? They survived it by banding themselves together, being each other's keeper. The Times refer to them as bands of socialists buying up land in community. In other words then, for instance, 83 persons, it was 83 persons who bought Plantation Northbrook, which was then subsequently renamed Plantation Victoria. And in that 83 persons who purchased that plantation, there were 5 women. Now, these 83 persons came from Enmore Plantation, Enmore Plantation Hope, Plantation Dutchford, and two other plantations. There were 5 plantations they came from. And they came together. They were headmen and foremen. They came together and they pooled the $10,000 that was needed for the purchase of Plantation Northbrook, which was then renamed Victoria. And there was this very interesting thing I found out when I was doing some research at the Mona campus in terms of our ancestors' history. Not only did they come together, not only did they bind themselves to beat the conditions which the Europeans had placed upon them, but if one of the members of that group did not have money to contribute to the purchase, one who had said to the other one who did not have, here was going to happen. I am going to put in your share of the money so that you can have a share in the purchase of this property. Another very interesting aspect of the purchase of these properties, of these estates, is the element of trust which existed between our foreparents. I'll repeat that. The element of trust, because we have become a very distrustful people. In fact, we have become a people who trust their enemies more than they trust themselves. And I'm not arguing that you must blindly trust a black man because he's a black man. He could con you. But we have got to address this element of distrust in our community and our foolish trust of our enemies over the need for us to work and repair the trust amongst ourselves. Our ancestors were so trusting in each other that at least in one instance I saw an occasion on which a number of them bought a property, a plantation, and they allowed one person to go and sign for it. But that was a general practice. Sometimes 40 persons may buy an estate, but they allow 4 or 5 persons to execute that purchase on their behalf and become the legal owners of that estate on behalf of all. It's a very important lesson for us.
I need to say something at this point. The thing is, initially, as happened at Northbrook, known today as Victoria, the people were able to buy it as a group. In fact, that purchase resulted in maybe the formation of the first known cooperative society in the world. We will discuss that at another date. But after a while, because the powers that be in the day realized that these people, our forebears, are putting money in somebody for 10 miles away, 15 miles away, they put some money together and they buy in these things. And so they said, look, no more cooperative buying. Anybody who wants to buy must find his own money and buy. So Kojo McPherson was able to buy Litchfield, but then he subdivided it back to the people who made the contribution, right? Immediately. So that's the trust you're talking about. So they were able to find a way to rise above the challenges offered.
All right, let us highlight that point that you made, Brother Elton. And I give you an opportunity to highlight it. Highlight the point that Kojo was the sole purchaser, but then what happened afterwards, and give the whole context. Highlight it.
Immediately after he bought that plantation, he then went about subdividing it among the other persons who made contributions, right? First it was 8, but those 8 individually, some would have taken money again from other people, and they further made the subdivisions. So Litchfield was then occupied by a community of people who all contributed towards its purchase. Look, it is the kind of trust that you were talking about just a few moments ago that we need to have in each other today, right? Kojo did not decide, well, look, this thing is me named today, so to hell with it, you tried it. He knew what was his duty to a people. And we must always put our people first and their needs and some being selfish. Because Kojo could have just easily decided, look, this here is in my name, and that is how the white man wanted it, so then we all hold on and we can see how we can do it. But he knew that it would have brought discontent sometime, and because people would not have been happy to know that at the end of the day we agreed on one thing and then we turned and something else was done. So he did the right thing to do alongside his people, divided lands, and so everybody was able to have their share, and Litchfield progressed as a community today. No, and I must say something else too. We see today, some people are saying that the lands that our ancestors have purchased, I'll take for instance Kingley. You mentioned Kingley. There was some foolish man, I will call him, who is our Attorney General. Because I must say he's a fool, because he said that there were families living on that land for over 200 years. 200 years ago, Kingley was a plantation. So none of the families that are there today could have been there over 200 years. Mr. Nandala. So the thing you're trying to prove is foolish. Kingley was born by our ancestors, period. Yes, my brother Jonathan, in your discourse about our contribution towards the development of Guyana, is there anything, because we want this conversation to continue, we want people to be discussing this thing, let them find out what their ancestors have done in their individual villages. We must understand our villages belongs to us. Yes, they may be a local authority, an NDC, Neighborhood Development Council, or whatever supervising, but they are working for us, the people, and not for the minister, as is stated in Chapter 2802. Chapter 2802 gives that or the Minister of Local Government and the Local Government Commission supreme control over our villages today. That is our property, properties that our parents bought. We need to do something about that, so that others will not come and take advantage of us because they are friends of a minister or they are known to the Local Government Commission. We have to protect that. I'm not against the Local Government Commission, which will ensure that the laws and the morals and the whatever that should govern the community are in place. I think we need that sort of, should I call it as, not a supervising body, but a body that will ensure that fair play is carried out. Right? But decisions as to what goes on in the village, how things are happening in the village, should be all local decisions. Yes, we can go to those bodies for ratification to ensure that justice was done, nobody was disadvantaged, and so on and so on. But not those bodies, the minister and the LGC, Local Government Commission, deciding for us in our villages. I think that's wrong.
My brother Elton, but forgive me, past performance is an indication of future performance. And the behavior and the discrimination that we are witnessing, which is being meted out to us, is nothing new. Every time some other grouping, when the white people rule this country, they discriminated against us. Each successive PPP administration has discriminated against us. Amerindians were used in a system of discrimination against us when we attempted to free ourselves, either by self-freeing ourselves, that they called runaways. They captured us, brought us back, they ringed back up the plantation. The Portuguese came and they discriminated against us. They were used to discriminate against us in the form of business. The Chinese, it was the same. So what we see is that we are ring-fenced historically and ethnically in a system of discrimination. Now I'm a realist, because these acts of discrimination are not lessening and they're not going away. We have to receive, like the Amerindians have received, the opportunity to govern ourselves to a certain extent, to a greater than lesser extent, so that we can make decisions that will impact us. The other thing is that, Brother Elton, nobody can understand what we went through, because we are the only people in the history of mankind to have been so disemboweled culturally, economically, etc. I think that somewhere in the local government legislation, there is provision made for village councils, as they call them, village councils. And I think if a petition is signed by sufficient persons in a village, they can provide that to the local government commission or whatever it is, and the village council can be established in that particular village based upon the request of the people. I think what we need in the interim, as we are moving towards that position, where we become a monumented people nationally, is that reenactment of the village council, whereby in a predominantly African area, we can have an African administration administering the affairs of that community on behalf of the Africans in that community. Because what we have at the moment is, like, for instance, on the east coast, you may have an African village which is in a council which is dominated by Indians. And you know what is going to happen there. The history has shown what has happened there. But there is something that I would like to close up, because in this particular program, I am personally of the opinion, it's not a personal preference, it is just a logical and sensible preference, and it is historical and cultural. I'd like to pay respects to the women folk in our ancestry who were brave enough to, on the 7th of November 1839, and when I do this, I'm talking to all the black women in this country. The 7th of November 1839, when they purchased Plantation Northbrook, when the 83 persons purchased Plantation Northbrook, there were 5 women in that group of purchasers: Maria Grant, Belinda Hopkinson, Catherine Tom, Molly Archer, and Hannah Foster. And I mentioned that within the context of, to pay respects to our female who are holding as much as they can, and to encourage them, to hold. And also I'd like to point out that, for instance, at Plantation New Orange, Nassau, our ancestors, which is Buxton, you fancy name, Plantation New Orange, Nassau, the purchase price there was $10,000. Our ancestors didn't have all the money, so what they do is that they push their hand in their pocket and they go and dig up in the ground with it, they bury the $100 thing, and they pull $6,000 out of the $10,000. And then they issue the promissory note for $4,000 to the persons who they were purchasing it from. But this is what is important. In the same way, as Brother Elton pointed out, the trust which existed between the laborers at the bottom of the ladder, if you want to put it that way, in the context of the purchase of Litchfield, and they pooled their monies and they gave it to the 8, and then the 8 went to Kodjo and said, Kodjo, you take this money and go and buy this thing for me. And then when Kodjo bought it, he came back to the 8 and he said, here, you take this, and this. And then the 8 called those who gave him money and said, here, this is you own, that is you own, that is you own. And so the trust was developed among themselves. But not only that was not the only area of trust. There was an area of trust which was developed between our ancestors and the attorneys and the white plant owners. Because in the instance of the purchase of Buxton, within 3 weeks of the issuing of that promissory note, they raised the $4,000 and went back to the attorney or the owner and gave him the $4,000 and got access to the plantation. So our people were a people who developed trust not only amongst themselves, but outside of the community. And I think that is one of the things that we have got to work for. The persons who came together to purchase Plantation Blue, Orange, Nassau came from Dutch Fort, Ants Grove, Hope, Paradise, and Enmore. So all the black people in that area, not only in Buxton, but the black people who live at Dutch Fort, Ants Grove, Hope, Paradise, and Enmore can know that they have contributed to a historical movement. And whenever you walk the road, pull your chest high in the air to know that you have given something to this nation which nobody else has given, but which all have benefited from, and that you did it for your survival.
Thank you very much, Brother Jonathan. I hope we continue this discussion.
I am welcomed to be a continuing part of this discussion. And you know, for the general viewing audience who have an emotional attachment to Black Forum, refer to me as Black Forum.